Hey everybody, I'm Mayor Pam Hemminger of the town of Chapel Hill, and we are delighted that you came to join us today. We're delighted to host the just majority, all demand action, all those things here in a town that values civil rights, LGBTQ rights, everyone's rights. And I love that you picked this spot here to be with us, where we have dedicated a monument to our own Chapel Hill 9. 9 high school young men stood up for justice. They were arrested, convicted, and we wanted to honor their bravery and their effort, which they should not have had to do in a just society. So we are here today to help spread the word, to help make sure people understand that there are things we can do to improve our Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, so that we get the justice that is fair and equitable for everyone. And I'm so delighted that we have a wonderful group of folks to speak with you and give you real information, and that we're spreading the word and standing up for what we believe in. So I'm going to introduce Reverend Al Sharpton. Come on up, and thank you again for joining us here. We're so pleased.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and to all of us that have gathered. Let me say that as we stand with the just majority, we don't have to go into ancient history to see what a limited court, a partisan court, can do to this country. The fight for civil and human rights that is personified by the Chapel Hill 9 was not a partisan fight. It was not a Democrat or Republican fight, or right-wing or left-wing fight. It was a fight about humanity. It was a fight about human rights. And that's what this fight of a just majority is about. When you can see a court based on partisanship take away women's right to choose, and may take away affirmative action, and may take away other rights, it's time for us to expand the court, to expand the options of justice and civil and human rights. And that's why we in the civil rights community stand with a just majority. We need to expand the court. The fact that they gave one decision on voting that may be right is like giving us an omelet with no eggs. We need to have a whole court that is wholesome at all times, representing the American people. And the personification of that is our partner in this, who embodies the spirit, legacy, and work of his father and mother. And let me bring the chairman of the Drum Major Institute, Martin Luther King III.
Thank you very much, Reverend Sharpton, Mayor, Professor Roosevelt, Arndrea, and Rev. While we are just a few standing here today, the hope is we are representing a number of communities. And what this effort, as you have probably been briefed, is about, is expansion of the Supreme Court. So there are 40 organizations at a minimum that are working to arouse the consciousness of our nation. I think my dad would say now is the time, as he said many times throughout his leadership. Certainly this is the 60th anniversary year of the March on Washington, where he shared his dream and vision for our nation and world. And while one would ask, is that dream fulfilled? Very quickly, we can easily say, obviously not. In fact, we probably are not in the vicinity of what he would have achieved 60 years later. It does not mean we hadn't made progress, I will say that. But it certainly means we have got to work far more diligently to realize the dream. This is an effort that I would call a marathon, not a sprint. we often went to the Supreme Court for relief over the years. And by and large, the court looked forward. But at the Dobbs decision in 2022 that took away women's rights, the court chose to look backward and take a dramatic step backward. And in the next few days or so, we must see what will happen, as Rev has stated, with affirmative action and so many other things. Voting rights are being suppressed around this nation. In my own state of Georgia, you can't even bring water to a person standing in line. And most of those polling places where people are standing in line happen to be in communities of color. In Houston, I was in Houston a few days back, where we came with the coalition as well, and with Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. And the state legislature of Texas voted a piece of legislation that applies to one county out of over 200 counties in the state. At least in Georgia, although we're not where we need to be, the rules that they are making do apply to all the counties. How do you provide legislation around voting, democracy, inclusion, and say, well, we're going to make an exception with this particular county? And it only happens to be the largest Democratic county in the state. It happens to be the county with its most diverse in population. And the list goes on and on. But if we had a Voting Rights Act, which the courts, the Supreme Court of our land, eviscerated in 2013. And so, you know, we are in a marathon. And with a court that's strictly political, we need to think about expansion. Expansion, by the way, has happened on a number of occasions. So the court has not always been benign. It is not constitutionally set. You know, you've got almost a Hippocratic body. Just think about the ethics of the court. You've seen the story. I don't need to go into the specifics. But the fact of the matter is, the Supreme Court has no ethics provisions. They must not if a justice can have somebody pay for a vacation for them that's over $500,000, one vacation. And there's many, many other things. But this is not so much to criticize, but is to create a consciousness for change, to make our nation, and this is something Dad said, not great again, because a lot of us don't know when that period was. I can't pretty much define. That doesn't mean we have not had moments of greatness. But Dad talked about making America become the nation that it ought to be for all of her residents. And that's what our task is on this quest to go around the country talking about expanding the Supreme Court for true, unfettered justice for all people. Now let me present my wife, my partner in social justice, and and most importantly, the mother of our activist child, Yolanda Renee King, my wife, and president of the Drum Major Institute, Arndrea Waters King.
Good afternoon. We are here together today because we are unwavering in our stand for democracy. We are here because the Supreme Court has been in the business of legislating oppression. They have decided to regulate women instead of guns. They are granting guns more rights than our kids, ripping voting rights to shreds, and ruling in lockstep with the rich and powerful. At this point, our children have steadily lost rights, and now the court's ruling could harm the future education for generations to come. In the Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and Students for Fair Admissions versus UNC, the court could wreak havoc on the ability of minority students to attain an education that puts them on equal playing field with their peers. Democracy is not about special rights. It's about the right to exist. It's about equality of opportunity. Democracy is not a completed job. It is a continually developing process. And yes, last week's ruling was a small victory in the sense that it preserves what little was left of the Voting Rights Act, but the decision does not strengthen the act. It merely keeps the status quo after the Supreme Court gutted the act in 2013. Even a broken clock shows the correct time 2 times a day. That doesn't mean the clock doesn't need to be fixed. We are here to say that we stand for laws that lift us all up, not limit us. That it's time for the court to legislate democracy and be a beacon of hope and restitution. Equal justice under law. These words are written above the main entrance to the Supreme Court building. It expresses the ultimate responsibility of the Supreme Court of the United States. No one is above the law, including the highest court of law in our land. And now I would like to bring forth Professor Kermit Roosevelt.
Thank you. I'm going to start with a little history. So 160 years ago, we fought a war against slavery. We fought for liberty, for equality. And we won that war, and we enshrined our victory in the Constitution, in the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. And in the 14th Amendment, we said no state shall deny any person the equal protection of the laws, meaning equality is our national value. We will not have a society based on racial classes. And Reconstruction moved us towards equality. Now, I say we fought that war, but of course we were fighting other Americans who had a different view about how society should be structured. And they lost the war, but they didn't go away, and their views didn't go away either. They came back fast and violently. And within a couple of decades, the gains of Reconstruction were mostly swept away. And then for almost 100 years, the Supreme Court ignored the Reconstruction Amendments. And we had segregation and disenfranchisement and the restoration of a society based on racial class. Then around the middle of the last century, things changed again. Not because of the Supreme Court, but because of social movements and activists. People like Martin Luther King Jr., people like you. They said, we're going to bring the Reconstruction Amendments back to life. We're going to make America live up to its promises. And people think about Supreme Court decisions like Brown, but that wasn't the most important part. The important part was people set out to dismantle the system of racial class, the system that had been built up from slavery and Jim Crow and segregation and hundreds of years of discrimination and oppression. And that's what affirmative action is. It's an attempt to make good on the promise that we won't have a society built on racial class. And it worked for a while. The Civil Rights Movement, the Second Reconstruction, that brought us closer to equality. But what we're seeing now is a backlash. And the Supreme Court is a big part of that. They're saying, no, the government can't try to promote equality. It can't try to undo the effects of our history. It can't try to dismantle that system. And the constitutional provision that they say stops the government from trying to promote equality is the Equal Protection Clause, the one we put in to protect equality. Now, I think that's crazy, and most people who study constitutional history agree with me. But this Supreme Court doesn't represent the views of most people. It represents an extremist minority that managed to take it over, and that's not right. That's not how it's supposed to work. So I believe in the American people. I believe in the American democratic system. But for that to work, you got to let people vote, and elections have to mean something. And the 6-3 majority we have on the Supreme Court now, they were put there by people who lost 5 out of the last 8 presidential elections, who lost the popular vote 7 out of those 8 times. That's not right. But they're in control now, and if we don't do something about it, they'll be in control for the next 40 years, pushing their extreme views on the rest of the American people, even if they keep losing elections. So that's not right. That's why we need court expansion, to put we the people back in charge. Mayor Hemminger is going to take questions now. Thank you.
I'm going to facilitate any questions you have because we have a very well-informed group. Yes.
Well, so if the Supreme Court says race can't be considered, it's going to change, it's going to upend the admission systems that schools use. And there's a question like, how can they respond? What will the consequences be? We have some information about this from the experience in California, where they banned consideration of race and the representation of students of color plummeted. It was very hard to work their way back from that, and they've tried, but they haven't gotten back to where they were. So I think it's pretty clear this is going to have a big negative effect.
Can I add to that? Because I think the professor's right. It was catastrophic what happened in California. But the problem, if the court rules that race cannot be a factor, it will overlap even out of education, because then the private sector can say we can't consider race with contracts. We can't consider race with our board makeup. We can't consider race in terms of employment. And when people like Martin and Arndrea and I go to a company and say, are you diverse? Well, we can't keep that data because it is against the law now to judge by race. They will have undermined the entire movement of diversity in this country with that decision. So it's not limited to academia. It will be referenced by everybody.
Yes, over here.
Well, so the question there, I think, is who should decide this issue? And my view is this is an issue where the Constitution doesn't tell you what you have to do. And in particular, the idea that the 14th Amendment, the post-Civil War amendment that's trying to promote racial equality, stops the government from trying to advance the cause of racial equality, that I think is completely wrong. So if people want to vote, if school boards, if the Board of Regents or the Board of Governors wants to adopt a particular admissions policy that they think is wise and they're the experts, that's a decision I think should be left up to them. What's happening here is the Supreme Court is coming in an anti-democratic way, and it's not letting the people choose, and it's not letting the schools choose, and they're imposing their own views. So it's this takeover of the democratic process that I think is particularly alarming.
And I want to add, based also on the professor's comments, that, again, we have the vast majority of justices that are not doing the will of people. I'm not quite sure. I would push back a little bit with you, perhaps, on the fact of the vast majority of Americans not agreeing with affirmative action, because everything else points direct opposite. When you look at the candidates that have won the popular vote, when you look at when you're polling people state by state, that you do overwhelmingly have a lot of people that support diversity, equity, and inclusion, affirmative action, equal access, and they understand that these laws are in place because of the fact of where our society has been. And that is why we're here today. We're saying that these courts are not standing at the will of the people, whether we're talking about affirmative action, of course, whether you're talking about voting rights, whether you're talking about women's rights. We see again and again that a small minority actually is controlling the vast majority of people.
Yeah. Over here, and then we'll come back.
Yeah, well, I think that it would definitely have an impact on HBCUs because, one, many that will not be able to use fair admissions to some schools will now be overloading HBCUs who are underfunded. They will, HBCUs who do try and fundraise in the private sector and public sector talks about how they effectively deal with black education and bringing us up to par where you can't even make a fundraising appeal if you can't use race any longer. Look at what's going on right now. People, private businesses, Arndrea and Martin and I was talking about it just a minute ago. Private businesses are being boycotted for just saying they're woke. So imagine if you say that you want to have a fair racial equality if this court goes that way. You will be in many ways penalized, and I think that's the danger of this decision. And I might add, Arndrea is correct, it doesn't go by polling, it goes by what is good for the country. If they took a poll in 1865, we'd still be slaves. If they took a poll in 1954, we would never have gotten the Civil Rights Act of 64. So it's not about a poll, it's about what protects us from the tyranny of the majority in a time that law needs to stand up for what the country stands up for. But I might add, too, brother, if we're going by polls, they could have never overturned Dobbs.
And also, we've talked a lot about what will happen, the trickle effect if affirmative action is reversed. But we also, we have a 15-year-old daughter, right? So not only do you have to look at higher education, but what will happen to primary schools, middle schools, and high schools? What will happen to affirmative action and the kids that are applying and they are having access to quality education? So not only do we need to look at the trickle effect up, we need to look at the trickle effect foundationally and how this is impacting our children from kindergarten. Now we're going to be looking at kindergarten all the way to the grave if this comes down in favor of dismantling affirmative action.
Just in relationship to, you mean overall points? Well, first of all, there's legislation that has been presented or that is being or going to be presented for a proposal from the United States House side. Again, that's why I said it's really a marathon, not a sprint. And the proposed legislation talks about adding up to 13 members. That is not in stone. It could be 12, it could be 15. There needs to be an established commission or group that is dedicated to doing the research and galvanizing, the energy of the nation. I also think that everything is about getting a message through. This is not a question you asked, but I'm going to say it anyway. Most people don't remember the last sermon that my father preached. One of the last sermons was at Riverside, remaining awake through a great revolution. Now, one political party has chosen to say being conscience or conscious, which is being awake, being aware of what is going on in your community, in your neighborhood, in your nation, in your schools, in your places of worship. And a party has decided that being awake or conscious is wrong. So we need to all go back to sleep is what is being said. And we're being challenged in that. But all these same people say, oh, we love Dr. King. We support Dr. King. You are a hypocrite if you're running around talking about it's wrong to be awoke. Certainly, there are policies that we have to carefully navigate to and through. But, you know, when we just arbitrarily decide, oh, we don't want that, it's all right to have the debate, I should say, because we've always had debate, but we've lost civility, particularly in the political discourse. My dad and mom and others taught us how to disagree without being disagreeable. Today, it's escalated to personally attacking everybody. If you don't agree with me, you know, even those who I don't agree with, I don't believe in attacking them. Let's debate these issues really, you know, in a real way. And the final thing I'll say is all of us probably here and in many places around the world have heard the I Have a Dream speech. The Drum Major Institute and the National Action Network, along with a vast coalition of organizations, will be convening on August 26th in Washington to recommit ourselves to engagement and the nation to really realize ultimately the dream that Martin Luther King Jr. had. He talked about the eradication of poverty, racism, and violence. And just about every problem we have can be found under one of those areas. And I'm saying that, though, to say that there's a silent, probably, majority that may not even want to be engaged, but we don't have a choice. I started off saying now is the time. Now is the time to begin talking about expanding the court. And hopefully we will get to the point where it will happen, where we will have a balanced court. Again, it's all right to disagree, but it should not be in a personalized fashion. You know, let me say this correctly. I've heard the I Have a Dream speech thousands of times, but I've only listened to hundreds. So you can hear stuff all the time. We're constantly hearing stuff, but we're not always listening. You hear with your ears, but you listen with your heart. So if we're able to get people to listen and to hear and listen, I believe we can make the kind of progress. But number one, Dad's dream and my mom's dream can come to fruition. We're a long, long way from it right now. But we are never going to give up. We're never going to give out. We're never going to give in. We have to continue to push forward and corral the consciousness. Dad would have said a revolution of values is needed. And if that revolution of values was intact, we wouldn't have a Supreme Court that politicizes everything. And it's almost like the nation had made progress. The Supreme Court is like whatever, I'll use, not the Dallas Cowboys or the Pittsburgh Steelers, but when I was growing up, they were strong teams. Their whole line will push you back. That's what has happened. People are being pushed all the way back. And there are some who certainly support those issues. But that is a disservice for our nation. It's a disservice for democracy. It's a disservice for, you know, the fact that it is said that a people that do not remember their history are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. It's totally disrespectful. And then I keep saying my apologies for continuing on, but I can't. Some things I think have to be said. We are mad about immigration. We need some serious immigration reform. No question about that. But everybody who's here is an immigrant. So you're going to say, oh, we can't allow immigration. None of us were here other than those who we mistreat almost the most. We always mistreat, unfortunately, communities of color bad. But the indigenous population. I mean, folks, they were the folks who were here. They should be. They have legitimacy to say what they're saying. But we got to have these hard conversations to figure out how do we create the climate so that America can become who she ought to be.
Well, I think that clearly, as we have uh, come together with this whole banner of for justice at the national level, it will have ramifications in state courts as well. But if your Supreme Court is expanded and made more fair, it sets up the apparatus to deal with that state by state. One of the reasons that civil rights, women's rights, and other groups went to the Supreme Court is so you wouldn't have the organizing task of just going state by state, but deal with a national model. And that is why we're doing this on a national level. So you deal with all 50 states' rulings, and then you can deal with decentralizing. If the Supreme Court makes a decision, the local state court has to abide by it. But even if you change the makeup of courts in 5 states, it doesn't mean anything to the other 45. The Supreme Court is the target in our campaign. I think that, one, they should contact their congressperson and ask their congressperson, are they on as one of the sponsors? Why it's only 57? As we're going into an election year in 24, now's the time to put all of your local congress people on notice that with Hank Johnson's bill, we expect to see your name there. Second, they ought to be, as Martin has said, in Washington with us on August 26th. That's one of the things we're going to raise. It is absolutely frightening to me that my grandson, I only have one grandchild, 4 years old, my niece, their daughter, who is the same person, by the way, Yolanda, they will grow up with less rights than we grew up with. When I was 15, women had more rights than they have today. And on and on and on. We can't settle for that. And the price was paid and the blood was shed too much for us to go backwards in terms of making this country fair. And I believe everybody should have a fair trial, even those, as Martin and Arndrea say, that we disagree with. We don't wish ill on anyone. We just want an even playing field. But I pray for everyone to have a fair trial, including the guy going to be arraigned in about an hour and a half.
So I think, number one, I don't think that anybody needs to tell people what they want. Now, unfortunately or fortunately, it depends on your point of view, there is a constant programming and socialization that is going on in our society. So people end up telling people, in other words, I don't go out and tell people, you need to vote for this person because I'm saying so. I may say that you might want to consider this because these are the things and that they represent. Fairness around voting, a woman's right to choose. And the list goes on and on. Issues around gun violence, as Arndrea said. I mean, how is a gun more important than an individual in this context, particularly women's rights? There are more women in the country than anybody. They're the majority. And yet, a lot of white males determine the fate of a woman's rights. And I mean, that's crazy. So my point is, all of the issues that we make that you are concerned about is what you really need to be thinking about. And it's really about, Arndrea and I and Yolanda, our daughter, were in Memphis with Justin Pearson. And, of course, he and his colleague, and three of them together, as you know, we all know, were thrown out of the legislature for doing their job. I mean, they weren't saying, well, we're going to burn it down. They were doing what they were supposed to do as legislators. And because the other side didn't agree with them, they expelled them. That's unconscionable. There may be some reasons. And while the same token things were going on, there were people who had abused children and all kinds of things who happened to be in their party, and they're still in office. Nobody threw them out. They shouldn't even be there. But the fact of the matter is there are double and triple and quadruple standards. So I guess what I'm saying is there is a consciousness that is arousing that will ultimately transform this nation. I see it in young people. I'm going to say we can't indict Black Lives Matter exclusively. We can say there were some people who led Black Lives Matter who messed up. People mess up every day. They have to be held accountable for messing up. But you can't discount all the things that have been done that Black Lives Matter. We go back to Trayvon Martin around the time that they started. You look at all those years that it's been, and you look at the progress. You look at the tragedy of George Floyd, when every state in this nation had a demonstration. That hadn't happened in a long time, and many of them were led by white young men and women and white mothers in every state, and not just the United States, of course, Europe and Australia and New Zealand and Canada and the African continent and South America, everywhere, probably with Iceland, probably too cold there, but everywhere else there was a demonstration. That mobilized and galvanized the attention of America, and for about a year there was a tectonic shift. Diversity, equity, inclusion departments were created. Resources were made available. And after about a year, my dad always talked about the inevitable pushback. Every time you make progress, there's always some pushback. 1963, right after the March on Washington, less than 3 weeks out, the 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed, and 4 little girls tragically lost their lives. After about a year, then something called critical race theory all of a sudden was discovered, as if it had not been taught in law schools primarily for 25 years. So you created an issue that's not an issue. Critical race theory is not taught in primary and public education systems, not at all. There could be an element, but that's just not true. The fact that you are discounting history now of black folk, you're banning books, blacks, the Holocaust, all kind of things that don't make sense, that I think most people, or many people, would like to have us go in a different direction. But yet we allow policymakers and we're allowing networks to say this is what is real and this is woke and this woke stuff is wrong. Well, why would you not want to understand information? And I'll go back to my wife again. She always says this is not about blaming somebody. It's not about collective guilt. It's about collective responsibility. We have a responsibility to do that which is just, right, and good for all people.
And one thing I would say as well for young people is that before Martin Luther King Jr. told the world about his dream, he told the world to give us the ballot. And I think all too often, young people, particularly when you see all of the problems, why should I vote doesn't matter. And one of the things that I always say to them is if you think that your vote doesn't matter, why has so much been done to take that voice away? From legislation to murders to, we just observed the 60th anniversary of Medgar Evers being assassinated in his yard in front of his children for registering people to vote. So if you think that your voice doesn't matter, if you think that you don't have power, why is there so much effort to take that away? Just a couple of years ago when women were celebrating getting the 100 years of having the right to vote, then yet again, that has been taken away. So I think it's incumbent of us to remember how powerful we all are, we the people.
happened that just don't feel like they should have. And that profound sense of discouragement, I can only imagine how exponentially more powerful it must feel to those of you who are on the front lines fighting for justice, equity. My question is, what gives you hope when that discouragement happens? What keeps you pushing forward?
Want me to tell you? I'm going to back up just a little bit, too, because we've talked a lot about the March on Washington. We've talked about children. We've talked about our daughter. We've talked about Rev's grandson, sorry. I knew that. But I just want to bring it home a little bit, because we are in the process of organizing for the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington. Okay. Martin Luther King Jr. has one grandchild. And so the one thing that people remember the most about the speech is my 4 little children. I can't imagine what Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King would think, that their one grandchild has progressively lost rights since the day that she was born. Our daughter, and Professor Roosevelt's daughter, was born in 2008. 2013, the Supreme Court, which this is what this initiative is about, basically decimated the Voting Rights Act. Okay? In 2020, our home state of Georgia, as Martin mentioned earlier, was one of the states that passed aggressive and draconian laws that's making it harder to vote. Also in 2020 and 2021 in our home state of Georgia, diversity, equity, inclusion was outlawed. So you can't teach history in the home state of Martin Luther King Jr. And then, of course, last year, as a female, our father lost rights as it relates to her body and health care. But even in the midst of all of this, we know that it has always been a few good women and men that have been on the forefront of making this country stand for what she says in paper, in reality. We have continued to push, and we will continue. We are unwavering in our stand for democracy. We understand that democracy is not about special rights for all. It's about equal opportunity for everyone. And we will continue, because it has always been, from the very beginning, the committed, dedicated few that have forced this nation to really be true to what she says that she is on paper. And when all else fails, what we do in our house is that we continue to listen to the speeches and the voices of Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King, because, you know, being Martin Luther King Jr.'s son, or for our daughter, granddaughter, or daughter-in-law, does not shield us from the racism, from the hurt. But one of the things that we do, we know that every single day we have to gird ourselves. We have to put on righteousness. We have to put on peace. We have to put on democracy. And we will continue to push for that, for our children, for our grandchildren, and for generations yet unborn.
Well, again, I want to say thank you for coming here to Chapel Hill. We hear you. We stand with you. Those of you out there, you need to spread the word. You need to show up. You need to stand up. You need to speak up. You need to keep the hope. You got to keep the hope. I have utmost faith in the younger generation. I have 4 children. They all fight for everyone's equal rights. They want to be in a country that values everyone. So, spread this word. I know it's going out on social media. I know that there's more work to be done. I know your tour is long, but bless you and thank you for doing it. Thank you for leading the charge, and we stand with you.